Thanks everybody for connecting, and welcome to the Geneva Macro Labs online talk, How to Hedge Against the Virus. I'm going to share my screen now. So can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So my name is Renate Guenther. I have the pleasure to be the vice president and the co-founder of the Geneva Macro Labs that we started together with our president Eckhart some years ago, and I will be moderating this online talk today. Normally, as you know, we meet in person for our after-work events, but due to the pandemic, we had to find new ways, and thanks everybody for adapting so quickly. This webinar will be recorded, and the results will be part of a short article summarizing the key takeaways from the discussion tonight, and I hope that's all fine for you. For those who don't know the Geneva Macro Labs yet, quickly, we are a do tank that scales the Lake Geneva area's intellectual potential and brings leading minds together. Our mission is to support the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN out of Switzerland. And we are an independent association, so we don't have a political agenda to follow. We started as a grassroots movement some years ago as we imagined what could be achieved in Geneva without institutional silos and bubbles, and if Rive Gauche and Rive Droite would come together and work on actionable solutions to tackle global issues. And our association counts about 20 members now. We have almost 680 followers on LinkedIn and more than 500 members in our online forum. And some of you might have been part of our conferences over the last 2 years or read our solutions papers. Thank you very much for supporting our ideas and contributing to our solutions. I look forward to a fruitful online talk with you now. And let's have a look what's on the agenda today. So we will have 2 presentations. The first one about risk management from a financial market perspective, and then understand risk management and resilience from a social scientist's viewpoint. And we are, of course, also interested in your view, how you manage risk in your sector. So please feel free to comment in the Zoom chat tool. You can also share that with us during the Q&A and open discussion in the second part of this webinar. So before we jump into the presentations, I'd like to kick off with a personal reflection. You might all agree that with COVID-19, we are probably facing the greatest challenge in our generation so far. This will impact not only public health, but also politics, culture, economy, and our society. And the current lockdown reminds me of what my mother told me about her childhood. And it always seemed so surreal to me when she told me how she went to school one day, and instead of having a gym class, the teacher told them at 8 o'clock in the morning that there was no more school as it was war. And my mother ran back with a group of children. They were on their way home, while the blue sky upon them filled up with the noise of approaching planes. Unfortunately, a lady saw this group of children from her house, opened the door and sheltered them before the attacks began. These days, we are not exposed to falling bombs, but to a rather invisible threat, which could hit at every time too. Being outside in the streets is a risk, like these children who were outside as the school had confused the pre-alarm with the main alarm and had told children to go home instead of immediately sending them to the nearby bunker. So understanding risk can save lives. We have the chance now to listen to our first speaker, Francesco Mochi Sismondi. Francesco grew up in Roma, before he moved to the UK for his advanced studies. He has almost 2 decades of experience in various risk management roles and will try to stuff it up into a 10-minute presentation for us now. Francesco, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Renate. Hopefully you can all hear me well.
Hello.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Renate, again for the great intro. I'll share my screen. Start with that. Great.
Perfect.
So as Renate alluded to, my name is Francesco, spent 20 years in the banking sector, and I'll be providing a few insights from the banking sector as it pertains to risk. I do apologize for any of those of you that come from the economic, finance, and banking sector. Some of this may be bread and butter, but we are a diverse group here, so I hope there are some interesting takeaways and motives for interaction and Q&A off the back of this. I thought I'd start with a bit of history in terms of where risk comes from. Risk has got a fairly long story, in fact. It is an integral part of everyone's lives. And in fact, we face risk as we leap, out of our houses to collect any benefits, whether it's to get food, to hunt as we used to do it in the old days, or do practically anything we like to pursue in our lives. So we've been at risk for quite some time, as the visual seems to suggest. Of course, our lives, our societies have become incredibly more complex, and with that, the risks have become more interconnected and difficult to manage. So I'll start off with the basics in terms of defining what risk is and how it applies to us. It applies to every one of us as we walk out of the house, as we get into our cars, as we use public transport, airplanes, trains, or conduct our day-to-day businesses. Therefore, whether we thought of ourselves that way, we are all risk managers. Now, some risks we face as individuals or private companies, I will be referring to the banking sector in particular. So some of the risks are deliberate. You want to take risks to pursue certain activities. Others are somewhat less deliberate. And risk is per se not a bad thing. It's a useful guide. Knowing your risks can lead us towards defining success and failure, and often life and death. The real danger is not knowing risks and failing to act upon the critical ones. So not preparing and understanding what your risk spectrum looks like can be quite a dangerous situation to be in. I'm cognizant of the fact that I don't have endless time, and I'm not going to take you into the world of risk management, acronyms, tools, statistical models, etc. Ultimately, risk management is really about applied common sense. So I thought I'd start off with a brief visualization in terms of key principles. All of this may sound fairly straightforward, but you can build frameworks and risk methodologies off the back of them. But think of risk this way. You can, as in the image, choose to avoid a risk when confronted with it. You can mitigate it. You could transfer it, or maybe insure it. That's why we take insurance around lots of activities we pursue. And at the same time, we can accept, once we know what the risk impact may look like, it's up to us to take that risk. A good starting place is really identifying that risk spectrum, knowing your risks. Do we actually go through that process of understanding what risks we're exposed to? So that typically should start, and does start, in many of the banks I've worked for at the time, of really identifying your key activities. What risks come with those activities? And then start thinking of measuring those risks. One of the typical ways is through a probability estimate and an impact estimate. So if we think of it from an impact perspective, trying to use an everyday example, what are we talking about? Is it the impact of losing your luggage or of an airplane crashing? And as it pertains to frequency, is it a seasonal flu or a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic? This changes a lot in the way you quantify risk and take steps to manage those. Understanding your risks and assessing them allows you to prioritize, to put them in some sort of logical order to then pursue what really matters most. What do you want to attack? We don't have limited resources and we can't manage every risk. We have to make choices. And with those, we can consider how to reduce any given risks we're exposed to. I thought this picture, cobbled together off the back of the World Economic Forum last year, is an indicative view of how a risk assessment could look like. Many banks do the same, where you take risks, you try and plot them against basically two axes. What's the probability, the likelihood of a certain risk, and what's the impact? And typically what ends up in the north right corner is the danger zone. These are the ones you really want to put steps and actions in place. Now, as we're talking of COVID, I'd like to just call to your attention where this was just a year ago, where the spread of infectious diseases sat in the World Economic Forum view. And that is already a reflection point in terms of clearly we can't attack and address everything at once. But clearly the likelihood of this type of event we're in now was considered significantly lower than many other extreme events. Once you know your risks, you can start thinking about what controls to have in place. So if you're driving an airplane, you may have a different choice of cockpits. Or if you're trying to manage technology risk, or perhaps in the banking and trading room, it's up to you as to what sort of technology you want to invest in. It sounds easy, perhaps, as to which choice you may go for, although we have different risk profiles. That's only human. But at the end of the day, there is no silver bullet. The answer as to how we manage risk and put controls in place depends on lots of different factors. First of them probably is context. What regulatory regime are we in? What political environment or economic environment are we in? Do we work for a private or a public company? And who owns the risk? Who's accountable? What when something goes wrong? Who takes ultimate responsibility? That then drives culture and incentives. What level of awareness, education is there around any given risk, and willingness to put steps in place. As I mentioned earlier, we also have different risk appetites and tolerance levels. Some people may like to go skiing off-piste, some others may not. Some people like flying, some prefer to have their feet on the ground. Costs also come with, controls also come at a cost. They don't come for free. So of course, the choice as to which cockpit or computer infrastructure to invest in may not be, may simply be a question of budgets to whichever business or individual is facing such choices. This is probably the only quasi-modeling image I wanted to talk you through, but I thought it'd be helpful to put it into a degree of perspectives. This is a tool that banks employ a fair amount, and it effectively tries to enable banks to think of their expected losses. Again, we have probability and loss, similar to the earlier graph plotting the risks. But here we're trying to understand how banks prepare to loss events. Now, in everyday activities, again, I'm going to use the banking sector. Most banks have a pretty good idea as to what they're good and less good at, and they have an expected loss amount. There are certain events that will just keep on happening, and as technologies improve, perhaps, and controls improve, those may come to a lesser degree. However, there is an amount of losses banks sort of budget for, if you like, and regulations have fairly set firm rules around setting capital aside. So banks have to actually put assets, capital aside to prevent and sustain those sorts of losses. At the same time, steps need to be taken in order to start evaluating the unexpected losses. So these are not the everyday losses. They're the once in a blue moon type events. Now, just going back a step, for expected losses, history is a good indicator. You can just look at what has happened in any given bank, collect that data and analyze it over time. And you can start looking at what neighbors and other banks are doing, which is now fairly widely available. We can understand what sorts of events happen in other banks. That helps you pretty much understand what this expected loss, let's call it the comfort zone, looks like. As I mentioned, this is not good enough, though. Banks are also expected to set aside more capital, and that's to sustain themselves and to be economically viable even in unprecedented loss scenarios. So these are sort of the search for fat tail events, as we call them. And that cannot simply be done through history books. Of course, history can be used as a yardstick, but it's typically done by plotting and articulating scenario what-if types of assessments. So thinking of hypothetical scenarios that may or may not impact your bank, and if so, what would be that extreme loss event in a, say, 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 year impact horizon? That's what I'd call the stress zone, and those values have to be computed and capitalized for. Now, the smaller banks are typically expected to put anywhere aside between 12 and 18% of their annual revenues. Just to put that into perspective, and the more advanced banks can use scenario modeling and compute through inferred statistical models what that number may be. But it can be a very chunky amount of capital put aside to enable the bank to continue operating. Anything to the right of that is panic zone. Trying to keep to a degree humorous, as obviously that's not a place anyone would want to be. So avoiding fat tail events or black swan events. And I'm just going to display a few, which I'm sure I don't need to explain. We've lived through these. Many of these will speak pretty clearly to all of you and will have resulted in major consequences to lots of sectors and industries and societies, not just to banks. So I'll just wrap up with a few closing remarks before I hand over to Marianne. We're pretty good at managing known expected losses. That's every day. That happens in our individual lives as much as it does in corporate life. But with modernization come new risks too. We're probably less good at integrating and really thinking of those risks up front as we deliberately start exposing to them. So as we embarked on the internet era, for instance, that we didn't quite think of what would come with cyber attacks, data leakage, and those sorts of vectors of risk attack. And scenario assessments are indeed a very helpful tool to consider and prepare for extreme events, but they're only so good insofar as they're a tool and they are used by the accountable owners, senior executives of companies. Having a tool per se sitting on a desktop in the hands of one or two people in the corner of a company are not going to crack it. If the ultimate owners, typically the C-section, the chief executive officers, operating officers of company, don't fully own and embrace risk and risk management and take steps to prepare for such events. So preparation is really key in order to manage any given event, not just the everyday ones, but clearly the most extreme ones, such as the one we're living in right now. So risk isn't going to go away anytime soon. Sounds obvious, but we might as well start managing the best we can. I'll stop there, but I'll be more than happy to take questions off the back of Marianne's piece. And if it's okay, I'll hand over to you and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Francesco. So responding to risk in the right way and to adapt to it quickly is crucial to manage dangerous situations well. And like the lady in my story, speaking with Francesco's model, she was in panic mode. She was in the panic zone when she sheltered my mother and her friends before the bombs fell. Otherwise, I might not be here today. So we now have the chance to listen to Dr. Marianne Schoerling, who will help us understand how we can adapt to risk in order to build resilience. Marianne is our head of stakeholder engagement at the Geneva Macro Labs, an executive member of the Afro-European Medical and Research Network, and a co-founder of the international initiative Bridging Development Gaps. Marianne holds a PhD in social science and has 15 years of consulting experience. And she also accepted the challenge to pass it all on to us in a brief presentation now. Marianne, you have the floor.
You're still on mute, Marianne.
Yes, sorry, I was just trying to technical. Voila. So can you hear me all?
Yes.
Okay.
It's all fine. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Renate, for this wonderful introduction. Well, we just heard from Francesco that we are all risk managers and do have some guiding principles at hand. What I would like to do now is to complement Francesco's thoughts by discussing with you why we might need to go beyond risk management if we want to become and stay resilient as a society and as individuals. So sure, we're living in a highly interconnected, complex world with systemic risks, financial crisis, environmental destruction, cyber attacks, or pandemics with the cascading threats, they concern all of us around the world. So the big question, how do we prepare for the unforeseen if we don't want to be reactive but proactive? So this is a question many of us probably asked themselves during the last week, while the environmental crisis dominated global risk assessment and as an effect, the global risk discourse. At a blow, we are realizing collectively how the spread of a virus of nanoparticle size turned into a global pandemic, which we have not expected. So what can we learn from recent sociological studies? While there was a tendency in social sciences to study globalization with its distributional aspects, recent focus turned towards issues of systemic instability that was generated by the new level of connectedness that we are witnessing. And these efforts included risk analysis that teaches us to appreciate how social problems are constructed and how responses to these problems reflect social order. So sociological studies, they provide several starting points. One that I would like to highlight is social analysis on globalization and systemic risk and their effects on inequalities. By looking at specific public discourses for narratives which function as a driving force for change, we can explore how risk perception influences decisions. Another great starting point can be the modeling of social network behavior or dynamic simulation of complex systems, and they help us to better understand interdependencies within and between systems. And we can study the spread of diseases by assessing health risks of specific groups of population and their effects on the health system. So to give you one example, societal aging and welfare effects, including chronic diseases like obesity or mental health, is paired with relatively more health services demand, which may in turn requires policy making to provide investment in nursing homes, as we can see now, incentives for future health workers or greater support of new technologies. Now, sociological risk research acknowledges that risks and risk problems are deeply embedded in the society we live in. Obviously, there is not one general sociological definition of what risks are, and this would be a complete different webinar to explore that with you. But depending on which school of thought you're referring to, there are different concepts that arise. And I would like to bring one interpretation to your attention that is based on a book that I wrote some years ago about the so-called the Entscheidungsgesellschaft, which translates into English as the decision society. Framing contemporary society as a decision-driven one points to the need to continuously communicate our choices as part of a strategy to manage uncertainties. And from this perspective, risk can be understood as the result of decisions under uncertainty, which means that risks can only be managed and socially validated case by case. So systemic risks are not constrained by specific locality, but occur ecocentric. However, how they are handled and perceived varies in place and in time, and that's something really important to take into account. Countries have different institutional memories of previous disasters. One example, after the 9/11 attacks, the reframing of infectious diseases as a national security threat under sanitary emergency became part of the strategy, and it contributed in the US to establish the city of New York as a key actor to address locally specific vulnerability. The COVID-19 experience right now shows that the virus affects specific groups of populations disproportionately, like, for instance, families with children, low-income individuals, healthcare workers, people over 60. and risk consciousness of the pandemic became something like I would call a symbolic resource, affecting all members of society. Also, our decisions how to respond affect populations disproportionately. Just yesterday, the Washington Post published an article discussing the lack of health equality in the States, as the novel coronavirus appears to be infecting and killing African Americans at a disproportional high rate, correlating with inequalities in access to care. So a new disease or new diseases in general are not self-evident and do not direct a specific societal response, but they are technically defined by those agents and institutions that are socially licensed to do so. And what we can witness right now is the important role of epidemiologists in that regard. So something I really love talking about is modernization. And I was reflecting for this webinar, how does modernization and risk come together? Well, in fact, there are some side effects of a decision-driven society. And one sociological explanation around the driving forces of our vulnerability and current societal transformation can be found in the idea of living in a time of reflective modernity. And this refers to a German sociologist called Ulrich Beck, and he called out the risk society as a consequence of processing insecurities and hazards introduced by modernization itself. So this concept is around 40 years old, yet it still describes well that every solution we develop addresses systemic risks, is creating additional uncertainties. In other words, unintended and unforeseen side effects of modern life backfire on modernity. And now adding the suffix 4.0 to the risk society, to Beck's diagnosis, recognizes that our society's evolution goes towards virtualization. And by means of technology, like Internet of Things, deep data, blockchain, quantum computing, some themes that we reflected in our work at the GeoMacro Labs, our social fabric is steered up. So innovation is now built on consensus, virtual and open sources, and collective intelligence. And in that dynamic, sustainability became what I call the new holy grail in light of the search for benefit companies. In fact, the COVID-19 experience functioned somewhat like a catalyst for telemedicine services. We can witness chatbots, interactive voice systems, AI-driven CT scan interpreter, and so on. But at the same time, we're creating additional risks like cybersecurity, cybersecurity breaches in healthcare organizations. They have put patient privacy at a high risk of being exposed. We can see how digital collaboration is going up. Within the last 3 months, Zoom, and we're right now using that application, has increased in 50% in its share price. And something to look out for as well are the many hackathons that we are witnessing right now in order to develop as a collective intelligence methodology, digital solutions in response to the current crisis. So now, when we go back to the theme of risk assessment, when does risk assessment become problematic? Now, the assessment of risks emphasizes always, and it's important to note, categorization, in which something is recognized and rated as a potential cause of harm. And they carry normative implication and assumptions regarding culture, systems capacity, political setting, or trust levels. So we have seen a lot of risk assessment the last few weeks around probabilities associated to the spread of the coronavirus. They have deployed been deployed to support narratives such as around who responded adequately to the pandemic, even though comparison was problematic. In the sense-making process of the virus, there were in particular 2 risks that have been discussed to differentiate COVID-19 from other pandemics like seasonal flu and influenza. And that was namely risk of death and risk of infection. So we could see in the media that the risk of death in China was around 3%, in South Korea 0.65%, in Italy 8%. Now, these probabilities were compared even though data deployed was based on different parameters. Testing approaches were different across countries and regions. Let's just think about Italy, where confinement applied at the beginning to different regions and not across the whole country. We see different social distancing measures in place. The presence of mild cases changes the whole dynamic. So these factors explain why we need to look at contextual factors when trying to interpret risk and assess risk. And another example is how time framing is conducted. We saw in the case of the UK that the UK has emphasized a longer time framing of risk and policy interventions by placing the narrative of herd immunity over a period of months. We see as well how risky such an approach has been, as UK right now has some major problems to respond to the current pandemic. So taking these challenges into account, where to start when we want to apply sociological risk assessment? I'll quickly highlight the three channels before I close with my presentation. Analyzing narratives in media reporting, social media discussion, and policy development allows us to detect tensions and inequalities. So different observation models can guide the analysis. One question could be who and what becomes a category in the narratives? How are risks attributed? Calling the coronavirus a Chinese virus is a racial and geopolitical framing. Another question, who and what becomes a point of reference within narratives? Is creating boundaries within society. The boundary between they and the other is continuously deployed. Italy became a memorial for late risk management. The second channel I would like to highlight is scenario planning, and this is something that Francesco already has touched on. Scenario planning from a sociological point of view needs to be always an interdisciplinary approach that helps us to explore difficult questions. And one difficult question that we are right now confronted with is the question, whose deaths are tolerated and at what cost in terms of massive disruption? Another question, how can confinement affect the protection of human rights? So scenarios do not forecast the future, but they help us to potentially to identify potential risks. And the last channel that I would like to highlight now is looking at system processes and simulating interdependencies. I've mentioned at the beginning the network analysis and modeling, and they can be quite helpful to start detecting inequalities within populations and prepare as well specific measures to protect high vulnerable groups and acknowledge how experiences and as well perception of government and in our case now healthcare organizations vary. So to conclude and going back to the initial question, risk management and our search for resilience, I would like to highlight that in order to develop resilient societies, the most important factor is to be looking out for pre-existing vulnerable conditions for specific population groups. Now, resilience and vulnerability are two umbrella terms within disaster risk research, and they right now are the latest, how can I say them, the latest interest in risk research, and both are important to keep in mind when we are trying to build resilient societies. The concept of resilience offers a perspective that includes the possibility of risk beyond those that we can identify and analyze with a risk analysis toolbox. So resilience of communities is considered beneficial for dealing with impacts yet not known. And to conclude with my presentation, let us think about resilience as a cycle that is continuously restarted. And it starts with preparing, then goes to preventing, then protect, respond, and recover. And in that way, we can reduce vulnerability across communities and as well across society as a whole. And I give over to Renate, and I'm very looking forward now to our discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marianne. So adapting to risk, being aware of pre-existing vulnerable conditions and including them into a risk management strategy, building scenarios, and we will talk about that at a later webinar, at a webinar in next month. That all can help to build resilient societies. So yeah, thanks to our speakers, and I already saw some comments and questions popping up in the chat tool, and we will now try to address them. Feel also free to speak out during the Q&A session, and I will share my screen now in order to have to open the floor to your questions. So who wants to go first?
Yeah, Renate, thank you very much to both speakers, Francesco and Marianne. Maybe also in reflection of the questions that came in from the chat, maybe we can ask both speakers giving us a very short assessment of what they think would have needed to be done to kind of prepare societies for this current pandemic. And I mean, preparing meaning not only in terms of scenario developments and or narratives, but also thinking about other institutional factors that would have needed to be put in place to help us to be more flexible and agile. I think that both Francesco and Marianne highlighted a number of key questions or key areas of importance for risk management, but I think I would like to see this more applied at a more systemic level, at the level of different societies, or what would have needed to be done in order to be better prepared for this pandemic.
Yeah.
I can attempt to answer that first, Eckhard, but perhaps my view is going to be somewhat biased in the narrower finance banking world, perhaps as a tool, if you like, in terms of some of the best practice we have used, but Marianne might be able to give a wider view off the back of that. I feel personally that the only times we've really ever been in a position to respond to large events is when you start putting frameworks into practice, and that means using model scenarios in the real world, and by that I mean simulations. You come out of your day-to-day life, and I'll give you a very narrow example. For instance, please forgive me, this is clearly outside the context of the corona panic situation we're in now, but think of fire alarm drills. We're now in many different sectors in a fairly normal habit of going through preparations of what would happen in the case of a fire drill. I'm sure we've all seen this in one way or another, whether in our apartments, companies, that we get used to running such drills. So going through drills of what could certain scenarios look like require preparation and execution, and that's fairly straightforward to contemplate and pursue in the private sector, because you have the capability of organizing that within your own context. It's clearly harder when you have to start embracing all the institutions and think of which scenarios and which simulations would it be worthwhile going through. That there could be endless options at any given point in time, and as I showed in my earlier slide around the World Economic Forum risk assessments, the risk of a pandemic didn't seem to be anywhere near the likeliest of events. But Marianne, perhaps you have a different lens to answer that question.
Yeah, so I agree only to to a certain point. Well, I think it has not been, or we are now not really witnessing the problem of bad preparation, but we are witnessing the ignorance of the effects within specific subgroups of the population. Why I'm saying this is because there has been several global risk assessment shared within the international community, but strangely, they have not really, with now referring to the pandemic, they have not really alarmed governments and institutions. There is the Global Health Security Report, which is, I think it's the first ever wide-ranging assessment and benchmarking of health security across 195 countries, and it has been published end of last year. And interestingly, the United States, the UK, and the Netherlands were assessed to be the most prepared countries for an epidemic. Now we are witnessing that the Netherlands, the UK, and the United States are among those countries who do actually experience kind of risk management that is not that has not been effective. We can see that it's always a question of how do we accept contextual drivers to be counterproductive to plans. I mean, we can be well prepared, but if the plans are not reflecting the social behavior of populations as well of politicians, then it's not leading to the desired outcome, which is reducing vulnerability, which is protecting your country. I'm quite interested to hear from the audience the perspective on what would be needed within the different sectors to support an adequate risk responsive plan. Is there somebody who would like to jump in here?
Maybe Marianne, I found it quite interesting to hear from your model of a risk society, where you approach vulnerable populations and manage the risk according to vulnerable populations. I have one question. Well, this usually you see children and women as the most vulnerable population. But the virus doesn't care. The virus took old men and is acting much more severe on men and old men especially. So the next virus might attack a completely different part of the population. And it's very hard to predict which group will be mostly affected.
So can you rephrase the question? So what is the question? You are trying to understand how to be well prepared if we cannot really understand the whole picture?
Yeah, we don't know what kind of risk is coming. Next time it might be a virus which is very hard on pregnant women and babies and or maybe on middle-aged population. We have a hard time to predict that. Yeah.
Well, in fact, I mean, we have to accept that there will be always the unknowns. We know that, and you saw that on my first slide with the comic. We know that we know for 100% that there will be unexpected events. I think from a sociological point of view, it's all about adaptivity. So we can actually put structures in place that allow us to if proactiveness is not possible, to be reactive in a way that we can respond in a fast manner to the changing environment. And something that I really welcome right now in our current situation is the surge of hackathons. It allows us to bring together different disciplines, people from different backgrounds, to develop very specific solutions for a very specific issue. And I believe that a society that allows for collective intelligence and maybe virtual reality rooms where we can do some behavior simulations, but as well on real time develop solutions for the very challenges within the responses to a massive disruption. That will be really helpful, and then I think that this is the way forward. I mean, as I explained, we are shifting towards virtualization. We are shifting towards a greater idea that we are living in a world that is highly interconnected. So why not using these forces, these drivers, as a source of inspiration, but as well as source of fast adaptivity to the challenges that are coming up. And another thing is we have seen the role of trusted agents like the WHO, of Gavi, and other institutions, and I'm a strong advocate, or I'm strongly advocating for developing a multidisciplinary global technical council on infectious diseases, which we have not seen before. I mean, we experienced Ebola, we experienced Zika, we experienced influenza, but up to now we don't have a multidisciplinary global framework nor institution that would allow for using that collective intelligence that we have as a society. And we have not touched that right now on during the presentation, but when we think about the effects of the pandemic in Africa, it shows a completely different scenario as we are witnessing right here. I mean, in Africa, I've just realized the other day, 80% of its economy is informal. So how do you respond to a pandemic, or in that sense to an epidemic, if your economic structure is highly informally organized? So in that setting, adaptivity means that you allow for platforms where people can come together from the different backgrounds and develop solutions, digital solutions, or community-based solutions that help the people in their context to respond to the changing environment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And as Marianne suggested, is there somebody who would like to talk about another sector? We covered the banking sector, we covered public health. Is there another sector, some experience from another sector regarding risk management that you would like to add here?
Well, actually, I wouldn't like to add in particular, but I have another question when it comes to policymakers, because, you know, policymakers currently are confronted with quite a high degree of uncertainty. Now the question is, they haven't seen this kind of precedent of this magnitude of a pandemic in modern times, and all these far-reaching health measures they have to take. Could you potentially provide any future directions for global health policies and risk governments?
Well, I guess this question is directed to me, since Francesco was talking about some guiding principles. Well, what we are experiencing right now with the global health crisis is that we cannot ignore specific continents, and we cannot ignore the effects of being interconnected. I believe that policymakers need to take that interconnectedness better into account by providing these mechanisms of collaborations that go across sectors. As a sociologist, I'm really happy to see that in several countries, not only epidemiologists have been consulted for the response to this crisis, but as well social sciences. And this is one direction or a one recommendation to include different sciences, not only those who work on a medical solution, but as well those who provide the sensitivity and the professional insight, how the implementation of a possible vaccination, for example, should be carried out. A lot of times we can see in the response to unforeseen epidemics or epidemics and endemics that there are always specific subgroups that have not been taken into account. One group right now, even in a country like Germany, that has been neglected and not looked at, are homeless people with no shelters. At the very moment when confinement was introduced, all shelters were closed. So how do we deal with those groups that already face lots of inequalities? This will be in the future hopefully on the agenda of policymakers, to understand that in fact our society is an interconnected system, and each group has its legitimate right for existence. And another area will be looking into human rights, which has been here in Europe around the question of democratic values and the right that our data is protected. In the criticism of countries like China, but at the same time, there has been not lots of discussion around what confinement measures mean in countries like India or South Africa. So, in order to be moving forward, we need to, at a global level, within the international community, bring these challenges to the attention of policymakers, to hold them accountable for those who have not gotten a voice to speak up right now. This will be an extremely difficult task, but I believe the more evidence and the more data we have that actually testifies human rights violations, the higher the pressure will be to hold them accountable and to have measures in place that are actually working against these abuses.
Yeah. So we are taking two more questions, and I found one in the chat. It's for Francesco. Francesco, what tools can the banking sector share around consistent risk classification and assessment, such that risk can be compared and contrasted consistently across one another within companies, but also across a wider industry?
Thank you. I see there's a comment actually. I'm just reading from Dr. Ashutosh on the chat as well, that kind of points to this. I was about to jump in on this very topic. I do find useful. So this is something I've seen change in the banking sector since I first started. That's 20 years or so ago. Is having a consistent risk labeling. This is set through sort of regulatory frameworks in the banking sector. All banks think of risks in the same groups, the same logical groupings. I'm not going to bore you with the full library and categorization of risk, but it's a good starting place to know that any bank anywhere in the world classifies its risks in the same way. And if you apply that to other industries, at least you could start comparing apples and apples. Now that's labeling. Yeah. Of course, then you need to get into the assessment piece, probability and impact. And of course, every country, context, so from a society perspective, economic perspective, will come with its own complexities. But I do feel this sort of a global consistency of framework is a path we have to keep expanding on across other areas of life. And today we're talking about a pandemic. Tomorrow, I see there's another note in the chat. We'll be talking about global change, climate change, which in fact we are already doing it. We've just parked it for a second until we get over this one. So yes, having consistent frameworks is certainly a great starting point. That also allows you to consolidate. You can do that in individual companies, but then start aggregating data consistently across geographies and different silos as you pick and choose. You can start having an assessment of a region, of a country, of the world.
Yeah, so in order to compare apples with apples and not like Marianne showed in her slides, we are all fruit comparing apples. And, yeah, we are taking one more question.
Yeah, can I ask one question? I'm just interested in the COVID-19 has created a different scenario. How the banks are responding, and if they've got any AI-based predictive analysis being done, or are you relying on the older models?
Sorry, that question might be directed to me, but I only half understood the question. Maybe the connection wasn't great.
Yeah.
Could someone repeat the question?
I'm asking if any artificial intelligence-based modeling, so for predictions on the losses and the risks because of the COVID-19, is being done by the banks or not?
Modeling regarding COVID-19.
Yeah. So I am not currently in a bank now, and that's only since December last year. And at that point, no modeling was being done in preparation for a possible pandemic. In fact, the risk of an event like this was not even on a map. Now I can't speak for the entire industry, but I'd be surprised if enormous amount of pandemic related modeling and preparation what was being done. I mean, having seen and compared and contrasted risk maps across different banks across the wider industry, it doesn't feel to me that this was a risk that was particularly worrisome until not long ago, and hence, as unfortunately often happens, extreme events happen and need to be responded in reactive mode as opposed to a preparation mode, proactive mode.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much, Francesco. That's really, it wasn't even in the risk model, so that's that's a statement.
Is that, may I ask if that's any different in any of the other industries represented on this call? As even, I showed the graph from the World Economic Forum from just a year ago, putting the probability of this event fairly low, but has anyone seen good examples of proactive preparation and modeling of any kind? And it doesn't even have to be uber quantifiable, good communications and transmission of education across the board in a faster way. I mean, from the time Wuhan was hit to the time we started seeing our, say, European societies respond, a fair amount of days/weeks, if not months, have taken place. We could have moved much faster. So I'd be keen on any closing sort of views from other industries.
Well, if I may take the computer industry, we not only know human viruses, but also we know computer viruses, and it's also quite difficult to estimate and fight threat. And if we see one industry that thrives in this situation, it's basically the digitalization of our society, which takes a big leap forward. And at the same time, we are kind of neglecting certain risks that come with this digitalization because, well, we just have to use it. So we are more vulnerable to any kind of computer virus attacks, emotet attacks. And hopefully it will not backfire, but that we can adjust our security models fast enough so that we will not be hit by the next virus, but this time by a digital virus in a couple of months. But it's basically quite a similar risk situation, because we know small risks. We can plan for small risk. We know some computer hacking attacks, but we also know there is this huge risk that our complete IT infrastructure might be taken down by some huge attack, and it's very hard to predict. And we, of course, we are doing a lot of things, maybe not enough to protect us against it, but it's a very hard to assess risk.
Yeah. Thank you, Jan. It was a very good webinar. Thanks for your contributions. We will publish the recorded webinar and a short article summarizing the key takeaways from the discussions tonight afterwards, later this week. And yeah, until end of May, probably we will have a series of weekly online talks now, all related to the pandemic. And I hope to see many of you next Wednesday at the same time, when we'll be talking about where we stand regarding the COVID-19 tests. We will have 2 medical doctors, and one of them is from the German Robert Koch Institute, researching on the topic of COVID-19 tests. And I'm excited that yesterday a member from the European Parliament agreed to also speak in one of our upcoming online talks. You might know her from our Davos event, Eva Kaili. She will be live at the Geneva Macro Labs soon. And we will keep you informed about that. So in the meantime, please stay in touch. Give us feedback on our webinar, discuss with us, become a member of the Geneva Macro Labs, suggest topics that we should cover. And I wish you a pleasant rest of the week and Easter break. Stay healthy and talk again soon. Goodbye for now.
Thank you, Renate.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Mhm.